When you think of money, you probably think of the rectangular bills that most of the world uses. However, you might not know, or even have ever thought, about why we just accept what is essentially a worthless piece of dyed paper for our work. To answer that, here's an overly simplified history of paper money, and why it's so important to today's economy, along with the broken barrier of commodity currency.
Before we can hit the road of how paper money was created, we need to address why we even need money. The reason money was invented is to simplify the daily act of trading. Back in the old days, people will just barter and exchange the goods that they've made. This worked well for the most part. However, the problem emerged when the population began to rise and the types of goods diversified. It became increasingly difficult to track what was worth what and who owed who what. Bartering also became difficult because the person you're trading with might not want what you're giving them. This is where money steps in. Money is simply just a third or intermediary item that everybody trusts and agrees has value.
It also isn't exactly one set item. People have used some strange things for money in the past. For example, whale teeth, stone donuts, tools, and feathers were used. However, the money that has been used the longest is the cowrie shell. This is a shell that was very hard to find back in the day, which made people believe that it has value, and thus trusted it. Another common material money was made of was gold and silver. This was probably its most recognized form. The reason all of these things were used as money is because they were rare or hard to obtain, so inflation won't be an issue and people wanted it. These goods are what is known as commodity currencies. The thing is, though, when paper money was introduced, it was none of these traits. It was just a way to get things that possess these traits.
Allow me to explain. The first use of paper money dates back to China, as it was written in Chapter 18 of Book 2 of the Travels of Marco Polo. In China, if the government owes you a large amount of money, they actually give you a piece of paper with the amount they owe you written on it. Some can refer to this as a government IOU. That way, if you need to get your money back, you can just turn it in at the capital. However, people noticed that the pieces of paper were much more convenient than actually going to the capital and getting their gold back. That's when the government started catching on and began giving people notes that can be redeemed by anyone, rather than just one specific person. This means that the pieces of paper were being traded without ever being handed in, because it was simply easier than carrying around a ton of gold or silver.
The type of paper money, like the ones used in China, are more commonly known as banknotes. It's basically a piece of paper that banks give you as a promise to return the gold or silver that you left with them. It is also the foundation for paper money. In Europe, this was first adopted in Sweden in 1661. As the idea became popular there, it spread to other parts of the continent. This generated some level of chaos within the countries, since anyone can just print money. These new notes aren't deemed illegal. However, some of these notes might not be accepted at certain places and shops, because the banks that the notes came from aren't trusted. This is possibly due to the fact that the banks are too small and can fail at any point. There's also the idea of fractional reserve banking, which is great in some situations and others that weren't. This basically means that a bank just has a percentage of your deposit on hand, and the other part of your money can be lent or given to someone else. This vastly expanded the money supply, since one person depositing $1,000 can possibly pay for 10 people trying to withdraw a total of $10,000. However, it was operating on the notion that not everyone was going to rush the bank to turn in their banknotes in all at once.
If everyone does try to turn in their banknotes all at once, though, there will be a funeral for the bank, because it's essentially impossible for them to pay all the people turning in their banknotes all at once, because they only keep a fraction of each person's deposit on hand. The solution to this and many future problems are two things: the gold standard and the central bank. Let's start with the central bank. A central bank is essentially a giant entity of a bank ran by a local government or authority. This bank produces one type of note for a large population so that everyone can use the same money. It also serves as a last resort for smaller banks during a rush when everyone is trying to turn in their banknotes all at once. This also gives the bank stability and power, since it's backed by a nation or a very powerful authority. For example, in England, people began to value Bank of England banknotes more than other banknotes because they knew it was backed by the English government, which meant that it was probably not going to fail unless the government did.
The next thing is the gold standard. This idea solved two major issues with the system of paper money. The first of these problems is the exchange rate. Right as paper money was taking off, so was international trade. This meant huge transactions with different currencies being exchanged. This brings up the issue of not knowing how to value certain countries' currencies. Here comes the gold standard to save the day. Let's say that $1 is worth 5 ounces of gold, and 1 British pound is worth 2 ounces of gold. Now exchange of different currency is easy. In our hypothetical situation, $2 are worth 5 British pounds. The second problem is inflation. Not long after people started to print money, they just figured that they can just print a ton of money and have more money. What they didn't consider was printing more money doesn't actually make more money. It just makes the existing money less valuable. Due to this totally unpredictable turn of events, many nations simply failed because they printed so much money that they made their current currency completely worthless. The gold standard put a small cap on this issue because the money was backed in gold, so you can only make as much money as you have gold. This way, you don't render your current currency worthless.
The gold standard also seems to create a problem that had already been solved by the introduction of paper money. The problem is the low supply of money. Before paper money was a thing, people just hoarded other commodity currencies. Thus, the money was no longer being circulated in the economy. The gold standard did diminish the problem though. Since the money was being backed in gold instead of directly using gold, there is more flexibility. Granted, there isn't much because there had been instances where the gold standard had to be suspended due to the fact that too much money was being used or there was a sudden discovery of a massive new gold source. All of these were temporary hiccups though. After the wars and gold rushes ended, the nations on the gold standard all hopped back on board and nothing really happened.
Then came World War I. The war to end all wars was one of the largest wars in all of human history, with a total of about 40 million civilian and military casualties, costing $208 billion in 1913, which is about $5.4 trillion in 2019. As you can probably imagine, this caused the gold standard to completely shatter. After the war, countries that were involved were simply too poor to keep backing money in gold, and this contributed to the Great Depression. Along with this, countries like Germany had to pay massive war reparations, and since the UK and France were also broke from spending so much on the war, they borrowed money from the United States. But since the Wall Street crashed, America wanted their money back. This was blocked by the fact that the United Kingdom and France couldn't pay back the United States until the Germans and Austrians paid them. But of course they couldn't because they just spent the last 5 years at war. This loop kept up for a while. The populace kept hoping that the governments could figure it out, but that never had a chance to happen.
That's because World War II just hit. This is the single biggest, bloodiest conflict in human history, costing about $290 billion in 1945, which is $4.1 trillion in 2019. It had a 75 million military and civilian casualties, or about 3% of the world's population at that time. This time, though, the governments that took part in the war were much wiser, and made the financial part of the war more manageable. Reparations were lowered, and the payments of it were also on better terms. To solve the whole situation of super unstable currencies, they decided to just peg everybody else's money to the United States dollar. That's because at this point, the United States basically had everybody's gold, because everyone bought so much stuff from the US during the two world wars. This formed the Bretton Woods Agreement. It stated that the United States dollar was redeemable in gold, and everyone else's currency was redeemable in US dollars. That is also why the US dollar is the reserve currency of the entire world. If you're a keen observer, though, you'd notice that the governments didn't actually do away with the gold standard. That change occurred in 1971, when Richard Nixon pulled the US off the gold standard due to the dollar being overvalued and the French trading in all their currency for gold. The really cool thing is that the other nations who had their currency attached to the US dollar just didn't bother to change it.
Now, the entire world's currencies are backed by the US dollar, and the US dollar is backed by nothing. Following this, other nations also decide to let their currencies float free, or to have no value related to commodities. This change may seem insignificant, but in reality, it's a big deal. We now have countries and economies with GDPs up to hundreds of trillions of dollars. This simply wasn't possible in the past, as we were confined by the amount of commodities in the world. But now that the money has been detached from them, we have much more freedom in how much money there is and what can be done with it. That's all because of a single change of philosophy, or as the extra history video put it, we have accepted money as an idea rather than a thing.